Welcome everyone to the Human Anatomy and Physiology class of B.Pharm first year and myself Mr.V.Roychowdhury, Assistant Professor of Department of Pharmaceutical Technology of JISU University, and today we'll be discussing about the basic anatomical terminology. So to begin we can say after this class, the students will learn about some basic terminology which are used by the healthcare professionals all around the world. So why this is needed? We can say that the scientists and the healthcare professionals use a common language of special terms when referring to a body structure and their functions. Now, the language of anatomy they use has precisely defined meanings that allow us to communicate clearly and precisely. And now, if we take an example of this, we can say that is it correct to say the wrist is above the finger? This might be true if our upper limbs are at our sides, but if we hold our hand up above our head, our fingers would be above our wrist. So to prevent this kind of confusion, anatomists use a standard anatomical position and a special vocabulary for relating body parts to one another. So these are mainly the contents that which we'll be discussing in this class. Firstly, we'll be discussing about the body position, then the regional names, the directional terms, the planes and the sections, the body cavities, the abdominopelvic regions and quadrants. Then we'll be concluding this class, and finally there will be some questions on this on this class, so which will help you in your exam purpose. So to begin with this body position, we can say that descriptions of any regions or part of the human body assumes that it is in a standard position of reference called the anatomical position. And in the anatomical position, the subject stands erect facing the observer with the head level of the eyes facing directly forward, and the feet are flat on the floor and directed forward, and the upper limbs are at the sides with the palms turned forward. Now, in the anatomical position, the body is upright. Now, two terms describes the reclining body is if the body is lying, lying face down, it is the prone position, and if the body is lying face up, it is the supine position. So next we'll be going to the regional names, where you can see that the human in this both these pictures you can see that the human body is divided into several major regions that can be identified externally. Now the principal region are the head, neck, trunk, upper limbs and the lower limbs. Now the head consists of the skull and face. The skull encloses and protects the brain. The face is the front portion of the head. This is the face, which is the front portion of the head. And it includes the eyes, nose, mouth, foreheads, cheeks, and chin. The neck supports the head and attaches it to the trunk. The trunk consists of the chest, abdomen, and pelvis. Now, each upper limb attaches to the trunk and consists of a shoulder, armpit, arms, then the forearms, then the wrist and hand. Now each lower limbs also attaches to the trunk and consists of the buttocks, then the thigh, then the leg, ankle and foot. The groin is the area on the front surface of the body marked by a crease on each side where the trunk attaches to the thigh. So moving on, we'll be discussing here about the directional terms. So the directional terms, as we can see in the picture, is used to locate various body structures. Now, these words that describe the position of one body part relative to another. Now, several directional terms are grouped in pairs that have opposite meanings, such as anterior and posterior. Now, here in this side, you can see that there are some directional terms, which are very common directional terms. These are superior, anterior, then inferior, posterior, medial, lateral, and here the definitions of each of them are given. So, the superior, what is the meaning of superior? Towards superior means towards the head, or the upper part of the structure. The inferior meaning, away from the head or the lower part of the structure. Then anterior is nearer to or at the front of the body, and posterior is nearer to or at the back of the body. And so everything is given there, and side by side you can see there are some examples which have been also given. Like for superior, if we take an example, we can say that the heart is superior to the liver. And if we take the example of a liver, we can say the stomach is inferior to the, the stomach is inferior to the lungs. So here is the lungs, and the stomach is inferior to the lung. And as we have seen in the superior, so we can say here is a liver, and the heart is so it is inferior to the it is superior when the heart is superior to the liver. So these are some examples, and these are some terms, the definitions and examples which have been given here. So when we move to the next slide, we are seeing here, a diagram is there, and we'll be as we study parts of the body relative to planes, imaginary, and these planes are the imaginary flat surfaces that passes through the body part. Now a sagittal plane is a vertical plane that divides the body or an organ into right and left sides. More specifically, when such a plane passes through the midline of the body or an organ, it divides it into equal right and equal left side. Now, it is called a mid-sagittal plane or a median plane. Now, the midline is an imaginary vertical line that divides the body into equal left and equal right side. So, if the sagittal plane does not pass through the midline, but instead divides the body or an organ into unequal right and left side, it is called the parasagittal plane. Now we can see a frontal or a coronal plane divides the body or an organ into anterior and posterior position. A transverse plane divides the body or an organ into superior and inferior position. Now, there are some other names of the transverse plane, cross-sectional or horizontal plane. Now, this sagittal, frontal, and transverse plane are all at right angles to one another. Now, an oblique plane, which is different from these planes, is passes through the body or an organ at an oblique angle. Now, what is an oblique angle? Oblique angle is an angle which is other than any angle other than the 90-degree angle. So here we can see that when we study body regions, we often view it in a section. So a section is a cut of a body or one of its organ made along one of the plane, just in the previous slide which we have described. So it is important to know that the plane of the section, so we can understand the anatomical relationship of one part to another. Now, here is a structure, or here is a diagram which in the left hand side shows the plane, and the photographs it shows the plane, and on the right hand side it shows the resulting sections. So next we'll be moving in to the body cavities, and as we can say that body cavities are spaces within the body that helps then protect. It helps to protect, then separate and support internal organs. Bones, muscles, ligaments, and other structures separate the various body cavities from one another. So the cranial bone forms a hollow space of the head called the cranial cavity, which contains the brain. The bones of the vertebral column, that is a backbone, forms the vertebral canal, which contains the spinal cord. Now, the cranial cavity and the vertebral canal are continuous with one another. The three layers of protective tissues, the meninges and a shock absorbing fluid surrounds the brain and the spinal cord. Now, so here we are seeing about the thoracic cavity, and the major body cavities of the trunk are the thoracic and the abdominopelvic cavity. Now the thoracic cavity or the chest cavity is formed by the ribs mm, and the muscles of the chest and the sternum. mm, uh, and the thoracic portion of the vertebral column. Now, within the thoracic cavity are the pericardial cavity. As you can see, there is a pericardial cavity. So, uh, this pericardial cavity is a fluid-filled space that surrounds the heart, and then there will be two two fluid-filled spaces called the pleural cavities. Now, one surrounding each lungs. So this is the right pleural cavity, and there will be a left pleural cavity. So there are two pleural cavities which surrounds the lungs. Now, the central part of the thoracic cavity is an anatomical region called the mediastinum. As you can see in the picture, in the central part, this is the mediastinum. Mm, it is between the lungs, extending from the sternum to the vertebral column, and from the first rib to the diaphragm. Now, the mediastinum contains all thoracic organs except the lungs themselves. Now, among the sternum in the mediastinum are the heart, esophagus, trachea, thymus, and several large blood vessels that enter and exit the heart. The diaphragm is a dome-shaped muscle that separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominopelvic cavity. Now, this is the diaphragm which is separating the thoracic cavity from the abdominopelvic cavity. So this is the the transverse section, an inferior view of the transverse section of the thoracic cavity. Here you can see the parts of this thoracic cavity. And then we'll be moving on to the abdominopelvic cavity. Now, the abdominopelvic cavity extends from the diaphragm to the groin, and it's encircled by the abdominal muscular walls and the bones and muscles of the pelvis. As the name suggests, the abdominopelvic cavity is divided into two portions, even though no wall separates them. The superior portion, the abdominal cavity contains the stomach, spleen, then the liver, gallbladder, small intestine, and most of the large intestine. And the inferior portion, the pelvic cavity, contains the urinary bladder, portions of the large intestine, the internal organs of the reproductive system. Organs inside the thoracic and abdominopelvic cavity are called the viscera. So here we can see the regions and quadrants of the abdominopelvic cavity. So to describe the location of of the many abdominal and pelvic organs more easily, as anatomists and clinicians use two methods of dividing the abdominopelvic cavity into smaller areas. So the first method is uh, two horizontal and two vertical lines aligned like a tic-tac-toe grid, partitioning the cavity into 9 abdominopelvic regions. Now the top horizontal line, the top horizontal line, the subcostal line is drawn just inferior to the rib cage across the inferior portions of the stomach. The bottom horizontal line, the transtibular line, is drawn just inferior to the top of the hip bone. Now, two vertical lines, the left and the right mid-clavicular lines, are drawn through the midpoint of the clavicles, just medial to the nipples. The four lines, the four lines divide the abdominopelvic cavity into a larger middle section and smaller left and right section. Now, the names of the nine abdominopelvic regions are the the right hypochondriac, then the epigastric, then the left hypochondriac, the right lumbar, then the umbilical, the left lumbar, the right inguinal, the hypogastric, and the left inguinal. So that was the first method, how it was divided into 9 regions, and then the second method is simpler, and divides the abdominopelvic cavity into quadrants, as as we can see in this picture. It is just divided into quadrants, that is 4 parts. In this method, mid sagittal line and a transverse line are passed through the umbilicus, or simply the belly button. Now, the name of the abdominopelvic quadrants are the right upper quadrant, the left upper quadrant, the right lower quadrant, and the left lower quadrants. So the 9 regions, this is the 9 region division is more widely used for anatomical studies, and quadrants, quadrants are more commonly used by clinicians for describing the site of abdominopelvic pain, a tumor, or another abnormalities. So to conclude this class, we can say that we have studied about some common, all the common terminologies which has been used in anatomical study. We have studied about the body position, that is the anatomical position, then the regional names, the directional names, the body cavities, that is a thoracic cavity and the abdominopelvic cavity. How abdominopelvic cavity is is divided into 9 regions and into quadrants. So we have studied all those things in this class. And these are some questions that might help you in exam purpose. So first of all, you have to give the justification of why common terminology is used in anatomical studies. Then there are some definitions, that is the prone position, the supine position, the sagittal plane, the mid-sagittal plane, the parasagittal plane, then the oblique plane, the pericardial cavity, then the mediastinum. What do you mean by the quadrants, and what is abdominopelvic quadrants, and everything which has been studied. So these are few questions which have been put so that it might help you in all the exam purposes. So we have concluded 3 lectures in human anatomy and physiology, and thank you for your attention to the class, and we'll be moving to the further into the syllabus in our next class.